Welcome to this week's edition of the Old Paratrooper podcast. But before we get started, I want to tell you about our new sponsors, Veterans for Veterans. If you served after 1987 and your hearing's taken a knock from your time in the forces, these are the people to speak to. They've helped thousands of veterans like us claim compensation for tinnitus and hearing loss. They're ex-military themselves, so they genuinely get it.
It's free to check if you qualify, and the claims are no win, no fee. To get started, click the link in this video or visit veteransforveterans.co.uk.
If you haven't already, please hit subscribe. It helps more than you realise in getting the messages out there regarding veterans' mental health amongst the veterans community and the emergency services communities. Today's guest, retired Colonel and Veterans for Veterans Ambassador, Tim Collins. Good morning, Tim. How are you doing?
Good morning. Very well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for taking the time to come on. I massively appreciate it. It's always great to get British Army officers on, obviously a man of your calibre as well, and obviously, as we'll talk about moving forward, a Veterans for Veterans Ambassador. So, yeah, what I like to do, Tim, with all the podcasts, start at the beginning, bit about yourself, where you grew up, and kind of ultimately what led you down the route into the military and beyond. So, yeah, over to you.
Well, yeah, I was born in Belfast and grew up in East Belfast near to Hollywood, which is, I guess, north of County Down. I went to school at Royal Belfast Academical Institution. My father was a printer, self-employed, but I guess the army connection, there'd been people in the army in my family from down the generations for over 150 years. My uncle Norman served in the Second World War, first of all as Royal Engineer with the Chindits. He was the engineer officer for one of the Chindit columns. And then he went on, having left the regular army and the TA, he commanded the Enniskilling Fusiliers, which later became the Royal Irish Rangers. I was in the cadets at school, and I guess that was a sort of natural inclination. After university, I went to Queen's University Belfast, studied economics, and after graduation, I think it was a natural progression to gravitate towards the army. Bearing in mind, from about the age of 9, I was growing up with the troubles all around me, and for me, it wasn't unusual that the military was all there. I think coming from Northern Ireland, I think the first black person I ever saw was a sergeant in the parachute regiment who could see with my astonishment and smiled at me in a very kindly way. So I was well disposed towards the army, and I went to Sandhurst in 1981. Graduated in March of 1982. Went initially to the Royal Signals, and having done the communications qualifying course, was very clear that the Royal Signals was not for me, and so I transferred to the infantry, the Royal Irish Rangers in Berlin.
So, was it always kind of to go down the Sandhurst route? Was that kind of embedded in you, or was that based on what you were like at school and stuff like that?
Well, I'd actually joined the Ulster Defence Regiment when I was 17. So I was a soldier by night, a schoolboy by day. And I was in the Ulster Defence Regiment for about, a lot of months before they realised I was too young to deploy onto the streets. So they transferred me to the Territorial Army. So I was a signalman in 40 Signal Regiment. And whilst being a signalman there, they selected me for officer cadet training. But I never really, I was in the Officers Training Corps at Queen's, but I didn't go through for a TA commission. I waited until I'd graduated and then went for a regular commission.
Okay. I don't get to kind of ask many officers what Sandhurst was kind of like. Obviously, I have a lot of veterans on that went through your kind of depots and stuff. But I suppose an insight into Sandhurst would be absolutely great if you can give a bit of an insight into it.
Well, the thing about Sandhurst, my son, when he went through Sandhurst and his friends, I always say to them, I really enjoyed Sandhurst. At the time, it can be pretty bloody at times, but once you realise, and that's what I would advise to my son, is it's just a big game. Nobody's going to die. unless there's an accident. So it's just a big game. So play along and don't get too teary. There'll be times when you're absolutely on your chin strap. And the thing about Sandhurst is a bit like recruit training. The first few weeks are designed to completely crush you. And that's because they bring a bunch of civilians in and individuals, and through hard physical training and sleep deprivation, they forge them into neighbours. And once they learn to become neighbours and help each other, then you can start training them to be soldiers. But you first of all have to break them. And after that first 2 weeks, with a small quantity of sleep, they quickly realise that the reward in every day, they always feed you, but the reward at the end of the day is sleep. And so you can take as long as you like to do anything. It just means you don't get any sleep. And then the smart ones quickly realise if they work as a team, they can get more done quickly and they get more precious sleep. And within those small groups, you discover who the leaders are, you discover who the shirkers are, you discover who the ones that always need help are, and you'll look after them. And you discover who's good at what bits, and together you form a tight team. And together with that tight team, you win sleep. And then you quickly discover that's how armies work.
No, absolutely, and I think that's why they use the sleep deprivation, because I've said it before. I even liken it to having a young baby. You know, it's fine, but as soon as you get sleep deprived, that sleep deprived, it kind of causes stress. You lose your temper quickly, your concentration. So you can see why it's used to put people under the cosh, so to speak, can't you?
Yeah, well, it's the best way to get people who would normally be inclined never to speak to each other to quickly become not only neighbours but good friends. And friends, they'll be friends for life because of what they've been through together.
Yeah, absolutely. Then bonds you forge through training, and kind of, I always say about the life lessons that you learn coming through training. I still kind of rely on them heavily now, as you know, when I was a 17-year-old coming through power age training and stuff like proper life lessons that you learn. Obviously, Sandhurst was it 2 years training at Sandhurst or a year?
It's normally a year, but I was when I went through Sandhurst, I was a graduate, and at that time they had a graduate course, so it was only 20 months 20 weeks, I should say. So it was pretty short for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving forward, you've come through Sandhurst, you've gone to turn up at your battalion. What is that? Because again, I hear turning up at battalion as young Parrots, Toms, Joes, as whatever that for want of the better term. But what's it like turning up in a well-established unit like the Royal Irish, like a kind of well-respected unit, as a young officer? How does that feel? Because you must feel the kind of intimidation, so to speak, or the kind of that you're brand new, still only out of training, but you're obviously in a position. It's a bit of a weird one, isn't it? Because you are a senior rank, but you're brand new, so to speak.
Well, I mean, it's initially when you go to the depot and get your regimental kit, it's all very exciting, and the great pride of being part of a very old regiment is one thing. But when I arrived in Berlin, I realized that I had to fit in really two places. First of all, fit into the officers' mess with the other officers, the young officers and the older officers and the senior officers and the commanding officer. At the same time, you take command of a platoon. My platoon was about 28 strong. And these are everything from pretty experienced sergeant and corporals who have been around a long time through to brand new soldiers who are in their late teens, had never been away from home before and just getting used to being overseas. And you've got to establish yourself with those and create relationships, but learn from the platoon sergeant who really guides you through the first few months, but ultimately learn to take responsibility for what you're doing. So it's a hard apprenticeship.
And I can, like I say, but that's as officers you talk to kind of lead through. I can only relate to kind of my experiences, obviously, and I relate to kind of P companies and stuff like that. And P companies hard enough, but then when you're being an officer, you see that they have to be shown. They can't just blend in the middle. They have to be kind of up the front, pushing the front, leading from the front. So you've got all that kind of aspirations, all those kind of sort of things on top of just trying to fit in, haven't you? Being aware that you're a leader at the end of the day. You've got to lead by example.
Well, absolutely. And your responsibilities include finding out what's supposed to be happening, getting the orders, and then translating that. At the same time, your soldiers come first, so you don't get rest or get anything to eat until they're settled, they're rested, able to rest and get something to eat, and that's what's expected of them as of a young officer.
So how long before when you got to battalion, was your first kind of operational tour, and where was it?
I actually, in Berlin, it's not really an operational tour, so it's all training. The most operational thing I think I did in Berlin was, I can remember exactly, it was the 30th of January 1983. I was the guard commander at Spandau prison, guarding the only prisoner in there, who was Rudolf Hess, the deputy Fuhrer. And it was significant because it was the 50th anniversary on that day of the Nazis coming to power. So we all expected something would happen. It didn't. The old boy went to bed early. So really an operational tour, because at that stage the Irish Rangers weren't allowed to serve, being Irish, in Northern Ireland. So it wasn't until I'd really been in the army quite a while before I went to serve the Duke of Wellington's regiment, based in Palace Barracks, on a Northern Ireland tour, which took in Belfast and in South Armagh. That was really the first operational tour, and it was with another regiment. But later I would go on to lead a company of the Royal Irish Regiment in East Tyrone, and lead the 1st Battalion Royal Irish Regiment as the East Tyrone Battalion in 2001.
Yeah, the kind of, again, I talked about this yesterday with someone that knows you. I'll probably talk about that off air, a former member of the SAS. But we forget about Northern Ireland. It's weird now to get your head around. Like when you go to Iraq or you go to Afghanistan, it is desert. It's a different terrain. It's a kind of war zone, as we kind of know it in recent times. But being in Northern Ireland and walking around just a city, just a normal sort of UK city, it's weird now to look back on. Was that even stranger for yourself, bearing in mind that you grew up around those areas?
In some respects, it was an advantage and a disadvantage. In Belfast, I knew exactly where I was. You go into certain parts of the city and you know that this is a very dangerous place, and there's people there who will try and kill you. They kill plenty of their own people, and you're a bonus to them. You're just harder to kill. South Armagh was, unless you've done a tour in South Armagh, it's hard to describe. It's like Afghanistan on speed. You could work. If you were tired of living, you could walk through a gate. But usually, if you wanted to get home that night, if you came to a fence, you went to the hedge and cut your way through the hedge. You went through somewhere where it was totally unpredicted you would be, because there's a good chance if you didn't, you'd be flying up in the air about 200 feet. And people were being killed in South Armagh all the time. I was there. I can remember we did the Antler trial, which was piece of ECM equipment. It was a really heavy pack. And when the Antler came out, it came out at the same time, more or less, as the SA-80, and of course the light support weapon. So you always knew the newest bloke in the platoon, because he'd have the Antler and the light support weapon as his patrolling dog. But I remember being in Crossmaglen police station, and we were helicoptered in, and there was a large group of people who were going to go out and test Antler. And whilst we were waiting, one of the dog handlers there, he had a golden Labrador, and he was one of the explosives dogs, and the guy dashed off to go to the loo. Whilst he's away, we put cam cream on his dog, which was very funny. And when he came back, the dear old dog was cammed up, which he took very well, and the dog was just happy at the attention. And I think then we set off on foot and went out, and I think we were at about 40 minutes. I heard the bang. You couldn't miss the bang. You felt it in your chest. And when we got back to base, we had found out that the dog handler and the dog had detected a device. It had indicated the device, but as the handler walked forward, it detonated and killed both of them.
Wow. Again, this is what people kind of forget, because I don't think it's been overshadowed, so to speak. Obviously, time goes on, people forget, but you've got the Iraq and the Afghanistan conflicts, which are still in kind of memory to a lot of people, for good reason as well. But obviously, again, what you've said, South Armagh and stuff like that. I did a tour of South Armagh myself, I always said it was very, very good for soldiering. That's where you learn your craft because of the difficult environment. Exactly the stuff that you've said. You couldn't just cut through a gate, go over a culvert, across a bridge. You went through the river. You avoided all the easy kind of things. So you couldn't be lazy. You just had to be. It was good for soldiering, wasn't it, for young private soldiers and young officers and everyone as a whole?
Oh, totally. I mean, the thing is that, if you cut a corner, that's how they'd kill you. They had no other way of doing that. Later on, um, when I was operations officer with the SAS, we had the sniper threat in South Armagh. Pretty much we knew, and we knew from Special Branch Intelligence, that pretty much every other patrol that was leaving one of the bases there was being watched by Dickers with a view to a sniping. So pretty much, if there's a 4-man or a 16-man brick with four-man bricks, and you have one policeman with you, you had a 1 in 17 chance of being shot at any time in South Armagh, and it made a tour in South Armagh pretty stressful for the guys. And if you ever lost, I always said to my guys that if you ever lost the sense of fear going out the gate in South Armagh, you were in danger. You needed to be on your guard the whole time. You needed to be alert. The minute you let your guard down, or it was just another day, that's when they'll get you.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I say, that's the difficult part with complacency in an environment that feels like home or any other town or city in the UK, and you're cutting around. And it was easy. You saw it. You saw people get complacent. I think I fell into that trap myself on a number of occasions, but then you're very quickly reminded that there is still a real threat. And even now I hear stories talking to guests like yourself that I was there like late 90s. Sort of, I did East Tyrone, I did South Armagh, and even looking back, I didn't feel that it was that dangerous at the time, but there was still people being killed out there in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Right up until the sort of early 2000s, people were still getting shot, still IEDs, obviously a lot less frequent than probably through the 70s and 80s, but it was still a real threat, wasn't it?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, that's why you flew everywhere. We tried driving into South Armagh, and it was the easiest way to kill soldiers in large numbers. So that's why everything flew. Yeah, but East Tyrone, South Armagh, whilst they had the sniper threat, whereas in East Tyrone, they'd come out and they'd shoot at you, numbers of them, and that's why more of them were killed. It's very hard to get. South Armagh was very rare. You just didn't see them, and their form of warfare was dangerous. And Belfast was different again. You would have shoots in Belfast, you'd have IEDs in Belfast, but it was very different from South Armagh.
So, kind of moving forward from that one of your kind of early tours in Northern Ireland, how long would you have been with your unit before you thought, right, I'm going to have a crack at selection? Because again, selections are probably a different ball game for someone as an officer. You've just not got that whole kind of stress and stress on you of going on selection. You've got to be seen to be kind of a cut above again. Would you say that's a true statement?
Yeah, well, I think I was about 11 years old when I was with the cadets in Brecon, and on Penny Fan, and I saw these guys running past and with rucksacks, and we were asking our instructors who are they, and they kind of explained, and that's when we figured out that it was this unit. And then, of course, in Northern Ireland, you become aware of the activities of the SAS, and so and first joining the army, it seemed like something which was unattainable because the selection process was so selective. But eventually, I think I was 28, and shortly after I'd served with the Duke of Wellington's regiment, I was already a captain, and I decided it was time for me to, just being the junior division of the Staff College, I thought, if I'm going to do it, now's the time. I was fairly newly married, and I thought, if I'm going to do it, this is the time. And so my regiment gave me time off. I got off in June and July to train, and then went on the summer selection in August.
How did you find selection itself? I always ask this question about selection, and I get mixed reviews. I've had literally over the last 2 or 3 days spoke to 2 SAS, very well known SAS soldiers, and that they both, I asked them the same question as I'm going to ask you. Selection, which part for you did you think that's tough, or did you just find it all tough, or did you think not as tough as you thought? What was your kind of reflection on selection?
Um, the hills bit, which is actually technically selection itself, I loved. It was like being on holiday, every day getting out. You know what's not to love about racing around the hills? And there's a good bunch of us on selection. I wasn't surprised to see the attrition quickly grinding down. The first couple of days they get rid of the time wasters, and that's fine. And then we all sort of bond, and as people push on, it's a shame to see people dropping by the wayside. Most of the people on my selection who fell out during test week came back, and many of them went on to pass selection a second time round. But I really enjoyed that part. The jungle was difficult because it was 1988. I was an Irish captain on jungle selection. So if I said left, the answer was right. If I said black, the answer was white. You eventually had to get just used to the fact that that's the way it was, and just suck it up and not take it too personally and get on with it. A part of the, I guess, and if you did take it to heart, then that self-imposed pressure is the pressure really on you. At one stage, I got so tired of my selection staff. I thought I'd failed anyway, so I went to the sergeant major running it, and I just said, these people are disgraced the British Army uniform. You just need to be aware of that, because in my regiment we would not tolerate standards at that, and left it at that. But surprisingly, I then passed.
Or maybe they like that kind of gritty kind of sort of attitude. It's hard to say what I've never been on it, but I know a lot of people that have, and it's hard to kind of.
It depends, though. It tends to go in if the senior instructor allows bullying, then it gets out of hand. I can remember a really good guy who went on to be a sergeant major in the SAS from the Duke of Edinburgh's Royal Regiment, being asked to describe why the antenna sticking out of his smock was a metaphor for his whole life. And you're just thinking, this is pathetic, because he's a far better soldier than you two that are having a go at him. As it turned out, that was right, because neither of those two got past corporal. He went on to be a sergeant major, as it turned out.
Yeah, I suppose you're going to get that kind of stuff everywhere, aren't you? It's part and parcel. It is, like you're saying, probably the period of time you come through, probably even more so as well.
But that's an important part of selection, in that it comes in waves like anything else. And we've been through the whole iteration. We moved selection during foot and mouth to America when I was ops officer. But the one thing about selection is that when you have a good training officer and you have a good sergeant major of training squadron, it runs well. If somebody's not watching it the whole time and it gets out of hand, that's when people get injured. That's when people die on the hills, because somebody's broken SOPs by not bringing a jerry can of water to the requirement where it's meant to be, etc., etc. And that's what I found out throughout my career in the army, is that if everybody sticks to SOP and does their job, it'll be fine. So when people start taking shortcuts, or in their wisdom decide not to do an armory check on a Friday or whatever, that ends up with somebody getting their neck broken 3 weeks later elsewhere.
And I suppose that's why the self-discipline element, we go back to training, why when you are cold and wet, when you are hanging out your arse, when things are tough, you've got that self-discipline and motivation, and that they're the key skills that are ingrained in you two from day one, aren't they?
Completely. I mean, that's why selection is like it is. It's far better that somebody got so cold and wet that they jacked in the jungle than going, 12 months later when they're in the desert, when they're actually, people are depending on them, and then jacking in. That rarely happens, because those people are weeded out during the selection, particularly during the jungle phase. And things like, in the jungle, the extent of discipline, which is absolutely rigidly needed, to at night when you stop, do all your SOPs, quietly sit on stag on your berg, and then when it's dark, put your shelter up, take your dry clothes off, pack them carefully away in their waterproof dressing, put your dry clothes on, wet clothes away. Then in the morning, get up, take those precious dry clothes, pack them carefully away, put the wet clothes back on, which is horrible. Take your shelter down silently, and then sit on your bergen and do it all over again for 3 weeks. That's the discipline. That's before you do anything, and that's the discipline that's needed. And water discipline's important. Looking after each other, because when the signaler's getting the evening schedule out, you've got to be making his scoff at the same time. If you're the order officer, you're writing orders, etc. It's about everybody helping everybody, and if there's a weak link in the chain, you quickly find it. But very often they don't last very long, and they get rid of themselves.
Yeah, certain characters don't fit in them team environments, do they? It's under them harsh conditions. There's no room for someone that's not pulling the weight and stuff. Whether that's a part of their character or just the fact that they've had enough and that mentally they're not there. It's part. But like you say, that's why it's done the way it is. That's why they need people in there that are self-sufficient but can work as a team and self-motivate. All them values that we kind of value very, very high within the British Army. One part of selection that people don't really touch on, and I don't expect you, obviously, sir, to go into details, but is the E&E phase. How is that? How did you find that part? And is it as bad as what people say? Again, you get mixed bag reports on the E&E phase.
In the end of the day, that it's a big game, and you're just they muck you about and give you ragged uniforms, and then you take yourself off into the Welsh countryside. And I was the year I did it. It was in November. It was the coldest November in years. It was one night 6 below zero. So you just learn to, like a fox or something, find a hedge to hide in, curl up, and then next day think about eating. And I can remember actually watching a fox. When I was sitting one day contemplating a cup of tea, wishing I had a cup of tea, and a fox walked past with a leg of a lamb literally in its jaws, and I thought, I'll fight you for that. But I couldn't catch him. And eventually, now and again, is it cheating when you sort of bump into a local and catch a cup of tea off them? And that's enough to keep you going, that when you set off then in the dark, and you're there, at least you've and when you do go to the checkpoints, they give you a bit of bread and stuff, but in the end of the day, it's only going to last for a week. It's the last plank in that there's a certain amount, especially if you're an officer, there's a great amount of integrity involved, so just play the game. How hard can it be? And it's a great way for losing weight. The hardest part of selection, I think, came after combat survival, because once you'd finished it all and it was over, you went back to base and they laid on a big spread in the cookhouse, and I hadn't really eaten properly for about 6 days, and I just got torn into that. And then about 8 hours later, I found myself in the shooters giving birth. And I know what the pain of giving birth is like now, and that was easily the hardest part of selection. Teeth marks in the back of the door.
I think there's a bit of a book in there, the selection diet. So maybe there's some legs in that, maybe. No, so obviously, you passed selection. You went to Hereford, and again, really, what sort of reception do you get as an officer? Because again, I've had multiple SAS veterans on the podcast talking about their experience, and they say it's very kind of anticlimax. You just turned up. It's not like going and turning up at your kind of normal army unit. You just kind of handed your berry. Well done, you've done all right. You've gone to your battalion. You've gone to your unit. And how was you received when you got there, sir?
Well, I was unique, obviously, because not unique, but as a very obviously Northern Irish officer from the Irish Rangers, taking over a SAS troop at the height of the Troubles. Many of the guys from my troop had just come back from a rotation with the troop in Northern Ireland. So I think it took longer for people to be accepted, I guess, both as an officer and I guess as an Irish person than it would have been for other people. So that was a unusual thing. But eventually, when you're around long enough, they get used to you.
So how, if you don't mind me asking, do you like, because again, this is where it's different. Once you turn up at Hereford for private soldiers or, non-commissioned ranks, they go and they stay unless they get RTU'd for either a behavioural problem or they want to. They kind of stay for pretty much the rest of their career in most cases. Am I right in believing that the officers tend to do like a stint there, then have to go back to their sort of parent unit?
Well, that's actually the arrangement we have with the army, and that the understanding is that soldiers, when they go, they'll do 2 years probation and then they're permanent cadre and they stay. officers' careers being what they are, the understanding is that the regiment will loan the SAS an officer for 2 years, and then the expectation is they get them back and they go back into the regimental system or back into the staff, because the people who tend to go to the SAS tend to be those who are going to end up commanding their regiment anyway, and so they don't want to give them away easily. But it's a certain amount of kudos for regiments to have people going there. And it works both ways, because usually what happens is that when one, particularly an officer, goes passes selections there, then the next couple of years you'll get 5 or 6 other guys will go. So it works both ways. But the absolute expectation for officer career is that we'll loan you the guy for 2 years and maybe another 2 years as a squadron commander, but we also have to get our value out of them.
So was that for yourself? Did you spend 2 or 4 years? How long was you at Hereford?
Well, actually, I hung on to grim death in Hereford. I think I was one of the longest serving troop commanders, so I didn't coming up to 4 years. Usually it's 2 years, but I was badged in December of 1988, and I finally left in February of 1992 to go to the staff as an SO3. By that stage, I had to move on, or else my career would have been foiled, because at that stage I was doing my staff exams with looking forward to potentially getting into staff college. And so commanding officers at that stage said, you need to move on now, you've been here too long. It's nice, but you can have too much of a good thing. You need to move on now.
Okay, so you moved on from there to staff college, is that what?
Yeah, not the staff college. I went to the staff at Headquarters School of Infantry and was there for less than a year before I was actually picked up for staff college, and then I went to the staff college in February of 1993, and I did the 2-year staff college. So I did the scientific bit at Shrivenham because I somehow they thought somebody with economics degree knows something about science, which is kind of social science. But anyway, I did a year of that, and then I did a year at Camberley.
Right, okay. And then after that, was it then when you picked up commanding officer of?
No, well, then at Camberley, you go to Camberley as a late captain or major. I was a major when I went to Camberley, and I think there was 4 of the 4 people on my course were badged SAS, of whom 1 went off to staff and MOD, Ministry of Defence. 2 went to command. You have to do 2 years at command and 2 years at staff before you're eligible for promotion to lieutenant colonel. So I was selected at staff college to go back to the SAS as the operations officer, which is what we call a black bag job. It's a staff college graduate's job. So I went back as the operations officer. 2 of the others went back as squadron commanders. I'd love to have gone to be a squadron commander, but I now looking back on my career, and people who in the staff said, well, the fact you got picked up as the officer meant that you were the guy who's going to always get picked up for lieutenant colonel quicker. And as it turns out, I did 2 years at Hereford, went back to my regiment, the Royal Irish Regiment, and led them in East Tyrone, and then we're based out of Catterick and went to Canada. But I was only there for 18 months before I was dragged back to headquarters, Special Forces, and it's disappointing to have your tour of commanding soldiers cut short, but the reward was I was promoted lieutenant colonel at 38 and found myself working in headquarters Special Forces in London, back into the mix. And then eventually, I stayed there for 2 years. I was the SO1 operations, which means that you're the colonel in charge of worldwide operations. And during that time, there's a number of interesting operations which I was able to oversee and help plan, and that's a big reward in yourself. It's what the rest of the public never see going on quietly. They're watching Coronation Street and they don't know these things are going down, powered by the UK across the world, with a very small group of people. Some most successful, some less so.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe at a later date, yet to be confirmed, we may be talking about one of them operations, but again, we don't know yet if that's going to happen. But yeah, so I want to talk about a couple of things. Obviously, the speech. Now, I'm sure you've been asked about this. So I have read that apparently it's on the wall in the White House, I believe, the kind of speech you gave to the troops on the eve of kind of going into Iraq. And I just want to ask, was it written by yourself? Did it come from the heart? Was it off the cuff? How did that come about? Because I mean, it's the stuff of kind of, it is a legendary speech. I've read it. It is a rousing speech. I think it's what troops need before they go in and they cross a start line, before they go into a battle. Absolutely brilliant. But where did it come from?
Well, ultimately, it was, I guess, it's a slightly long story, but I took over as SO1 operations. The last operation I helped plan was Operation Barracks, which was Sierra Leone. It was the rescue of men from C Company of 1 Royal Irish. And the company which I had led prior to going to Headquarters Special Forces was C Company 1 Royal Irish. So I knew all the soldiers who were detained. And the rescue operation went ahead at the time when it was planned, and I was there in London when it was okayed. Frankly, we did not expect to see the guys alive, but we knew it had to be done anyway, in the off chance that they might still be alive. As it turns out, they were alive and they were rescued. But two things really came from that. First of all, the Royal Irish felt very bad about the whole operation because they had people captured, and the army, they thought very ill of them. Some people might have done. In Headquarters Special Forces and elsewhere, we were full of admiration because they didn't lose a day's training and not a thing on their operations, despite that hostage crisis happening around them. And also the conduct under capture of the men who were captured themselves was absolutely exemplary. They should have been given, they were subject to a number of mock executions, threatened with death and beaten all the time, and never once did they crack. In fact, we know from SIGINT, they terrified their captors by their behaviour. At one stage, one of the young Southern Irish soldiers, when they were beating the Sierra Leone Corporal Musa, he stepped forward. He said, enough. You want to beat somebody, try beating me. And they backed off at that, and they didn't hit Musa again. And it takes enormous courage to do that when you're in captivity, surrounded by. But that wasn't recognised. But we knew that happened. That was a pity for the Corblimey Tony Blair government. They were too interested in themselves to see where the real heroism was. But the net effect of that was that when I went back to take command of 1 Royal Irish, the heart was out of the battalion. The battalion was down to, we were 250 men under strength. I then ended up throwing out about another 50 guys, mainly for having links to Liverpool drug gangs and what have you. So we were about 300 men under strength, and the morale of the battalion was on the floor. So I realised that I needed to rebuild this battalion, both in terms of its morale and actually physically rebuild it. So the first thing I did was analyse what does people want from a commanding officer. And so I was very much about getting involved and talking to the soldiers and help through training and through, frankly, hard discipline, rebuilding their confidence amongst themselves. The second thing, we went to the Army Recruiting Group, and we sat down with them in London. Then we went to the Northern Ireland Recruiting Group and listened very carefully to the expertise and what they had to offer. We wrote it all down, and then we did exactly the opposite. And by doing so, we ended up with a fully manned battalion. We did crazy things like closed our recruiting office in London and opened one in Ireland. What? As an Irish battalion, what madness, they said. But we ended up with a fully manned battalion, more than fully manned battalion. By the time I was going there to the Gulf War, we were leaving soldiers behind who hadn't hit 18 because they couldn't deploy. The battalion was fully manned, and I was able at the same time, by being very parsimonious with what I actually told my brigade headquarters, we were able to keep our Gurkha company. So the Royal Irish deployed with 4 rifle companies as opposed to three Royal Irish rifle companies fully manned, and a fully manned Gurkha rifle company, as well as the battalion fully manned. What's more, we had a defence platoon, which other battalions didn't. In addition, we went at wartime establishment by getting territorial army soldiers to come along. So we were pretty well off from there. But the point being that it was a very young battalion. I had 5 sets of fathers and sons in the battalion. If you got into cousins and whatever, I think my regimental sergeant major had 3 brothers and 5 nephews in the battalion. It was a very young battalion, and it was very family oriented. And many of the soldiers, especially a lot of Southern Irish soldiers, had never been out of Ireland before until they'd been training in Canterbury. They'd come to Canterbury, and here they were about to go to war. So I felt a huge responsibility for this very young battalion, and also the fact that a lot of probably about 20% of my soldiers weren't British citizens either. They were citizens of the Irish Republic, and it was a neutral state. And so when you're taking soldiers of that, and the thing also that people don't realise and understand about Irish soldiers is that we've never had conscription in Ireland, ever. not in the First World War, not in the Second World War. Every Irish soldier you've ever seen in uniform is a volunteer. And so I had a battalion of volunteers as well, and very young ones. And so when you're leading volunteers, it's the realization that we were about to go to war. I'd been in the first Gulf War with the SAS in 1990 and 91. And I knew what was pretty much going to happen, and the high likelihood was we were going to lose soldiers dead, and I knew that. And for young soldiers who had never seen even grandparents dead, to take human life or to see their comrades killed, these were hard things to deal with. And so really it was addressing those young soldiers and also addressing them as Irishmen to help them understand that not only was the chain of command watching them, that their own country was watching them, and they were representative, and everything they did would be judged through that lens. So they were in a more precarious position than many, and that's really what I wanted to get across them. As for written and all the rest of it, I mean, there's lots of theories. There still is theories about who wrote it. Tony Blair's credited with it, and a number of other people. Lord Lucan, even in the Sun, it said, Tim Collins, legs akimbo, smoking his famous cigar and wearing his Ray-Ban glasses on top of a Challenger tank, giving. And I said to them, if we can get a photograph of that, carefully using your skill and judgment, circle the following items: a cigar, a pair of sunglasses, a tank. The fact of the matter was that the war had gone off ahead of time. We realised that that morning I went across the brigade headquarters, said, yeah, that's happening now. You need to get back, get the battalion to dispersal points, because there's a good chance we're going to get hit with Scud missiles. And so before we left, I thought, well, with a very young battalion, I had to gather around and tell them what the hell's going to happen. And of course, the ultimate thing was that when I was driving back, one of my young signallers who was driving, bloke from the northwest up Donegalway, and said to me, "Sir, are we about to invade Iraq?" I said, "Yes, we most certainly are." He said, "Not being funny here," and emphasised the boys are keen to go, but why? And so I thought, well, actually, I need to give them as much as I understand why we're going to invade Iraq. I need to tell them, because they don't know why. The thing about the soldiers is that what they want to know above all else is, are we there yet? So they'll go anywhere, but they just know, are they there? But on this occasion, I felt they needed to know why they were going and why it was so, and why, if this was the last chapter in their young, precious lives, why it was happening, and why, when they see the people over the border who at the end of their lives, why that had happened and how to deal with it.
Well, it's certainly one for the history books. Like I say, I think it had the kind of required effect that it was meant to do, and kind of motivate again sometimes in them circumstances, and what had gone on before, like you said, understaffed, and the stuff that had happened, with Sierra Leone and stuff. I think it had the desired effect, and kind of motivated the men, which is in effect what you want from your kind of sort of unit, isn't it?
Yeah.
Obviously, kind of like Power Rage of work with the Royal Irish, like in kind of 2006. I had Trevor Colt, who's won a military cross on the
Ranger Company with 3 Power, I think it was.
Yeah, and speak very, very highly of them, and they were involved in some absolute, probably, some of the fiercest fighting that we've seen since probably the Falklands and before. So I know there's lots of Power Rage friends that I have that speak very, very highly of the Royal Irish. What I want to touch on, and if it's not something you feel comfortable with, then that's absolutely fine. I can edit that out after. But it was about the allegations that came out, because I do this podcast, with the main goal of raising awareness for mental health amongst the military veterans community and the emergency services community as well, by talking to the guests. So obviously there was allegations against you and some of your soldiers about the mistreatment of prisoners. And I want to know, obviously later on, which we'll come on to, was found to be not true at all. No case to answer. But I want to know, how does that affect morale? How does that affect mental health when you're faced with them? Because they're serious allegations, aren't they?
Yeah, well, it depends. We're all different. What was the allegations against me were mistreating an American officer, which is simply disciplined because he was a prat. And even all the U.S. Marines were with us, were happy to fly in their own money to testify this was an utter twat. And then the allegations that I'd mistreated a Iraqi who was arrested for simply, his only crime was that he, amongst with 4 others, had planned to murder all the people who were working with us in the town that we were running. And I wasn't prepared to tolerate the people who were going to be murdered simply because they'd cooperated with us. So we went to visit all of these individuals, and all of them cooperated, and I left them in no doubt what would happen because I told them, we know your plan. You've been busted. One house I went to, and initially they denied it, and then I thought, okay, we can do this one of 2 ways, and they're like, no, I see where you're going with this one. So he then gave me the pistol, and his big fat wife even gave me a chit to sign for it. So with a flourish, I signed Jerry Adams and gave her back the. But the last guy we went to, he just absolutely blanked it and wasn't having it at all. And I was about to, eventually I gave up, and I thought, you know what, this guy, he's either a really good actor, or he's innocent. And I thought the likelihood, looking at him, school teacher, we're barking up the wrong tree. And as we walked out, my motor transport officer, who'd been my RSM, said to me, do you know who he looks like? And I said, no. He says, he looks just like Martin Main, who was a notorious mass murderer and IRA guy. And I thought, you know what, he's a spitting image of Martin Main. So I turned to my heel, and he was standing at his door grinning, and I caught him by the throat and walked him up his hall and walked him into his kitchen, slammed the door behind me, dragged my interpreter in and said, translate this for him. Tell him either he tells me where all the weapons are, or I'm going to put a shot through his fucking head. And he translated it back at me, at which point I then shot between his feet. And I said, the next one's going up your fucking nose. At which point he said, oh, okay. And that night they didn't hand it, but next day they handed 147 weapons in. And so nobody was murdered, and we took 147 weapons, and that was the war crime. I then went to be interviewed under caution by the MPs down at their base in Bulford. And the day I walked in, the irony of the Special Investigation Branch wanted to interview about and nonsense like that. But it so happened that day that 5 members of the Royal Military Police had been murdered in Majid al-Kabir. And I said to them, so you tell me, do you think I was overreacting?
Yeah. And that's what you'll always get, and that's the annoying bit. And I don't want to move into politics about.
No, but I mean, the thing is that again, that went on and on, because after the murder, they tried to go for a mate of mine who commanded a para battalion. They tried to nail it on him because they had been killed, and the thing was that they hadn't followed SOPs and they're out of comms, and they said, well, they maybe hadn't been given enough ammunition. He said, well, they're 50 rounds each, but it wouldn't matter if they had 5,000 rounds each. They didn't fire a shot. You missed the point here. They went into a position where their goodwill was overextended. But at that time, the jerk reaction of the British military leadership was to find and punish somebody for something that was out with. And then when we look back on it, and nobody ever says anything after I was cleared of war crimes, etc., and we'd lost 174 people killed in action. No one said, you know what, you were right, that was turning into a pretty ugly scene. And whilst you were there, it was under control, doing what you were doing. And after you left and we started to do different stuff, we ended up getting a lot of people killed. Nobody says that. But yeah, it just, if you were more, some people, if you take it to heart and worry about it and care about it, then it could affect your mental health. If you take the view, fuck them. I'm an Irish citizen, I have an Irish passport, fuck them. I'll go off and make money, and I did.
No, I'm not. Like I say, you always get it, and it's happening now. Again, without going into too much detail, you've got people in officers that have never been involved in situations like that judge. You get it all the time, and it's easy to judge in hindsight, isn't it? It's easy to sit there from your kind of office when you're trying to make a split decision and under the pressure that soldiers are and stuff like that. And I think that's the annoying bit.
It's a part of it's chain of command, though, and chain of command has its responsibility. And the chain of command, when I was there, had failed all the way along the line. All of that shouldn't have happened. And with hindsight, they realised that. Not everybody, but the ones that didn't, they got moved to one side, and they're nobody's. And nobody to remember them. Even they could lie dead for a week in their bed, and nobody would even find them. Whereas some of the more senior people, about a year after that had been cleared and I'd actually left the army, I got a call from the Chief of Defence Staff's MA and said that the Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Mike Walker, would like to take you for lunch at the Army Navy Club. And I went to lunch with Mike Walker, General Mike Walker, who's a very distinguished guy. And we sat in the corner of the Army Navy Club, had lunch, and he just said, I'm sorry. All of that should never have happened. He said, all I can say is, I'm sorry. And then he said, out of interest, how did you defend yourself? I said, well, I was very lucky because there was a guy who'd been former King's Regiment and then Ulster Defence Regiment, a guy called Lewis Cherry, who a great army solicitor. I was a civilian solicitor, works in the army area, and he defended me pro bono. And if I hadn't had him, then I'd have sunk below the. And Mike Walker said, well, then a great injustice would have been done. And so we left, and I went home, and I got a call that evening from Lewis Cherry and said, something happened today. And I'm like, what do you mean? He said, I've just been paid. I've just been told, to send all my invoices in. And I've been, General Freddie Viggers, who's the Adjutant General, said, just send us and we'll pay. And they just paid that day like that. So there's two different types out there. There's the honourable people who have seen it. And then there's the people who spent their career organising the Rhine Army Horse Show and had never been in a fight in the playground. And when warfare came along, they suddenly realised everyone's just looking at the war fighters and no one's paying any attention to this year's Rhine Army Horse Show or anything like that. How do we prevent the future? How can we prevent the army turning into a warfighting organisation where prestige of arms is rated more highly than the ability to put a good military tattoo together in the Berlin arena? And so the army changed completely on that.
No, that's good stuff. So it's fair to say that probably was that instrumental in kind of why you left because of that incident, would you say, or was you already?
Oh, I mean, completely. I mean, the British Army hated me, and I hated them right back. In fact, I think I hated them more than they hated me, if that's possible. And you play a game to fuck each other about, and we were good at that. The general who had took him to his headquarters to keep an eye on me, pathetic character, and his thing was neat pictures. And so in the headquarters land, I would always wait for him because I knew he was asthmatic, and his office on the third floor, and I would walk, and he could see me ahead of him every morning going up the stairs and into the corridor, and my office was in the next floor. And as he got to his office, all the way down the corridor, the pictures were all over the place. And I knew that stressed him more than anything, and that was huge fun. And then eventually left the army, and with the bitterest of bad will, they awarded me an OBE. And I can remember I was staying with my brother-in-law and my sister, and my brother-in-law knocked on the door and said at 6 o'clock in the morning, he said, yeah, you need to get up for your train up to London. We're in Guildford. And he said, by the way, apparently you've been awarded an OBE. And so I then went to the train station at Guildford, and I could see on the newsstand, the Daily Telegraph, Tim Collins Award OBE. It was on the front page. I was in the Metro as well. So I thought, right, you fuckers. So I turned my phone off, and I got the MOD, and I was told, Commander Shriven needs to speak just away. And I said, no, I'm going up the skiff in Northumberland House. And I went in there, and I waited till about lunchtime, and I came off, and I turned my phone on. I missed like 20 calls. So I phoned, and General, I'll not embarrass him with his name, called me and said, Tim, I'm trying to get hold of you. And I said, sir, calm down. Is it anything to do with this OBE? He says, yes, it is. I said, sir, I've dealt with this. I've told the media it's a fucking lie. Don't worry about that. I've turned that off. And he said, well, the point is you have been awarded an OBE. I said, oh, so you told the media, but you didn't tell me? Oh, no, what is all this? Like, yes, sir. And I did think about throwing it back at their faces, but then I thought, actually, and my wife said to me, it's not your medal, it's for your soldiers. It was what they did. And so for that reason, you shouldn't. I did accept it.
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. But no, obviously it's a good point that it's the troops would have probably wanted that, and it was for them.
And they deserved it, and and then it went beyond that, of course, because by that stage, the Sunday Express and the Sunday Mirror had accused my soldiers of war crimes on the basis of what I'd done. And, I thought, well, once I've dealt with the British, I will deal with the newspapers. And I did, and I turned on the newspapers and I sued them. And I took a large chunk of money off them for that, because you can't let those things go.
No, you've got to, because again, we all know the media, how they contrive, how they put stuff out there that's not true, and stuff like that. It can be massively, massively damaging. And obviously, you'll probably remember the whole thing. I don't know if that was part of the same kind of incident when they kind of put out there, didn't they, that their soldiers had done this, and it was fake. It was fake photos, for one.
Well, it wasn't just fake photos. Somebody asked me to look at it and sort of said, "Well, I can look at a glance of the photograph, and I can tell you that the combats are wrong, that and the truck." By that stage in Iraq, there wasn't trucks like that. I think the biggest thing that hit me in the eye at the first glance was that the Iraqi being beaten up was wearing a Syrian flag on his T-shirt. I thought, well, maybe they're kicking the shit out of him because they don't like the Syrians. Because whatever Baluba did it, didn't know the difference between an Iraqi flag and a Syrian flag, so he had the wrong one on. So, yeah, you can spot these things pretty quickly.
Yeah. No, but again, the media love that, don't they? Any story like that. And even though it was blatantly, obviously fake, it still made big news. So that's why they do it a lot of the time. Anyway, obviously, fast forwarding, you've kind of left the military. 2004, would this have been around that time?
That's right. Yeah, I left in August 2004 as my last day in uniform. And I did a number of things. Then eventually, again, to cut a long story short, I was approached by folks that I'd known from the US military. They, at that stage, realized the war in Iraq was about to go underground. They looked at the British experience of counterinsurgency. By that stage, there was very little high-level British experience of counterinsurgency because after 1998, it was like we did a brain dump of knowledge of counterinsurgency. So they wanted to understand that. And to cut a long story short, they said, how did you and the SAS know where to go and what to do in order to kill active terrorists in the IRA, who we think were a pretty competent terrorist organization? And I said to them, the reality was that we didn't. We did pretty much what we were told to do by Police Special Branch. Special Branch had the lead on all these things, and they were the successful arm, and they're like, what is and who is Special Branch? It just so happened at the time that was it. As a result of the Northern Ireland Peace Agreement, RUC Special Branch had been disbanded. All the Special Branch guys were being retired, and many of them had a lot of fights still in them. So, to cut a long story short, I formed a company. With using Police Special Branch, RUC, and some Garda Síochána Special Branch guys with cultural advisors who are like translators but understand the culture. We set up a Police Special Branch in Iraq. It was enormously successful in Anbar. Then it spread. The Americans paid for it to go across all the other parts of Iraq except in the British sector. Then in 2010, they did the same thing in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. Again, because it was successful in Afghanistan, it was spread right across the whole of Afghanistan as a large program called the Legacy Program. It was my company that delivered that, but as well as that, we did special forces training for African countries. We did counter-poaching, all sorts of things. And the company's still running, and we do this and that.
Yeah, awesome stuff. You touched on the whole politics thing for a little bit as well. What was kind of the decision with that? Was because that something to be involved with veterans and stuff like that?
Well, it was, coming from Northern Ireland, I'd been approached by constantly, and then in 2023, it was constant that both the Democratic Unionist Party and Ulster Unionist and others were sort of saying you can't just complain about Northern Ireland politics unless you go and do something about it. And I said to the DUP I could never be part of the DUP because our ideals, are very different. But eventually, I said I would have stood as an independent. But it would have been too complicated standing in where I stood in North Down. And I stood for the Ulster Unionist Party, but I made it clear I would pay for everything myself, and I did. Every penny in that campaign for me was paid for by me, and some which they got to keep for free. I looked at the state of Northern Ireland, which is heavily dependent on the UK taxpayer, and I don't think it's a great threat of and United Ireland, because still the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland want to stay with United Kingdom, most of them for about 60% for ideological reasons, the other 20% of that 80% because they like the NHS and things like the personal independence payments, which in Northern Ireland we call it disability living allowance, but that's a whole nother story. But the cut a long story short, I looked at the North Down where I came from, and I realized that the bottom 20% of the population just don't vote. They just don't think it's worth voting. They don't feel that the politics does anything for them. And the top 20% were the people who I went to university with, etc., who still live there. They don't vote either. They're above politics. It's all too important. They're too important to dirty their hands with politics. So my ambition was to go and get the top 20% to understand that if they wanted, they couldn't chatter about politics if they didn't vote. So get out and vote. And of the bottom 20%, I went around all the working class estates in North Down and held big rallies and well-attended rallies to get them out to vote. And they all said, yeah, and we get it. And I said, and if you don't, nothing will change. And they all nodded their heads. And I said, and that's how Sinn Féin, they make everybody vote and you don't. So get out there and make sure your friends, relatives vote. And everybody nodded their heads. And then on the day, out of one estate, Kilwillie Estate, I think there's 3,000 people eligible to vote. On the night, 19 people voted. I mean,
Wow.
And so I paid for myself. I say to the folks in Northern Ireland, if you don't vote, you don't get. They voted, and they got a guy who, on a second run at the thing, he won it. He's a modest man, much to be modest about, small chap with a comb over, and he a former clerical office at a local health trust, and that's what they've got in Parliament, and they got exactly what they deserved.
Yeah. Okay. Well, like I say, if some people with politics, they're not going to vote. They're not going to vote. All the kind of goodwill to try and get them to vote. It's obviously not going to work, is it? It's just.
Well, the thing was, I was really focusing as an economist on the wrong. I mean, I was looking at things like lowering taxes for the businesses. Business rates in Northern Ireland the highest anywhere. Business rates in Larne are higher than the High Street in Oxford Street in London. So that could be addressed if somebody had the brains to do it. We're suffering from the fact that Northern Ireland has the same VAT rate as the rest of the United Kingdom, but in the Irish Republic it's 13.5%. So I was making a case that if you lowered the VAT rate for hospitality only in Northern Ireland to 13.5% to match the Irish Republic, then we could increase the amount of taxes we take, increase the number of jobs we have, etc. I laid it all out and explained it to people, but nobody cares. And so it's a case of they're interested in why is my hedge not cut? What's happening to that pothole? Why can't I park in Bangor Min High Street? I'm like, well, if that's your priorities, I have nothing to offer you. And that's why I say for people in Northern Ireland, I have, as an economist with a master's degree in international relations and having built a business that's put £150 million into Northern Ireland in terms of wages, I have nothing to offer them.
No, well, that's a fair point. Can't say fairer than that. Obviously, I'm conscious that we've reached the hour point. I'd like to finish off on, obviously, Veterans for Veterans. You are an ambassador for Veterans for Veterans. They sponsor the podcast. So, yeah, what's your take on that? How did that come about? And where do you see yourself going with that in the future?
Well, the people are becoming more aware, and people are starting to realize that what they've done in service is that they were in service. And so if they've suffered disability as a result of service, it's not about charity. They are owed that for the injuries, and particularly hearing loss. And at the same time, guys who have been in my troop in the SAS got in touch with me to say they'd had hearing loss claims. One guy gave £6,000 to a solicitor he hasn't heard back from 2 years. What should he do? And I'm like, it's gone. But there is this alternative. There's these guys are veterans for veterans, so they talk veteran to veteran. They're accountable. Don't give anybody anything. Let these guys talk you through. You may have a claim, you may not. And what's more, they'll be upfront with you pretty early on to say, we don't think you got a claim there. So by all means, go elsewhere. But if you do have a valid claim, they've seen it all before. They'll walk you through it and they'll help you get the money you deserve. It's your money. You deserve it. I'm reminded of the story of the veteran who had hearing loss, and he went to see the MOD and he came out and his buddy said, how'd you get on? He said, He said not to get involved in compensation scheme. They gave me one of the latest Army hearing aids. He said, "Oh yeah, what's that?" He says, "Fantastic." He says, "High frequency, low frequency, Bluetooth. I can pick up my phone calls on that." And as soon as I'm straight back in the room. It's the best thing ever. It's a terrific hearing aid. But he said, "What type is it?" He says, "It's 3:15."
Yeah. The thing is that the battle you have with trying to convince veterans, as a lot of them, I was one of them as well myself. I didn't think I had hearing issues because I can still pass certain hearing sort of assessments for my job because it's different frequencies. That's the bit that kind of catches people out. They think, oh, I don't know if I'm eligible. All I say to people, like you kind of said, just give it a go. It's free, doesn't cost you anything. You'll be sent for a hearing test. If the hearing test comes back to say that you've got hearing damage, you then have a case and it can be pushed forward. You've got to have a go to stand a chance of getting some compensation.
I didn't realize, and on the day, I used to be pretty, because I was an anti-tank platoon commander, so I was pretty robust about making people wear their ear protection. But I didn't realize that the little Christmas trees they used to issue us didn't do jack shit. But at least you had them in your ear and you thought they were doing. But the thing is, the Army knew that they didn't do anything, and so people that have lost their hearing because they did protect their hearing or thought they were doing it because they'd used the kit. That's not fair. The fact is that if they've suffered as a result of that, they are owed compensation, and it's theirs. They have every right to that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And hopefully now we're getting the messages out there, obviously with you on board as an ambassador. Like I say, what people don't realise as well, they do a lot for veterans organisations. They sponsor my podcast. I'm a veteran myself. And again, everyone that they speak to on the phones are veterans. So again, we have the veterans.
Well, I mean, we got to remember that the people who are going to look after veterans best in this country are other veterans. That's a simple fact. And if you sit back and hope that the Armed Forces Covenant's going to protect you, or that's going to be recognised by the rest of the public, you're kidding yourself. We've got to look after each other. And when we start looking after each other, then we'll have maybe capacity to start looking after other people's. But we got to look after each other first. And that's where Veterans for Veterans is founded on that principle. And that's its bedrock.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Well, Tim, on that note, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. Thank you very much for taking the time to come on. I know you do all sorts of bits and bobs, and you are still a very busy man. So I appreciate it when you take the time to come on. It means a lot. It's been a thoroughly engaging chat. I've enjoyed you passing off your wisdom, knowledge, and experience, and I think it'll be a very, very popular podcast. So thank you very much. I will speak to you briefly in a second off air, but for now, Tim, thank you.
Thanks.
Stories from the edge where the healing begins.